Oh my God. We're not going to be able to cover all of these, folks. Typically, depending on what book you look at, there's usually somewhere between 30 and 35 recognized orders of insects. Now, just like we avoided some of the orders of arachnids and some of the orders of the crustacea, there's some of these orders to me that you're never going to see. Of course, the bug doc thinks they're absolutely amazing and interesting as can be and so forth. But if you're never going to see them or experience them, why do I even force you to even think about them? So in essence, we're going to take a subset of these orders, and the subset of the orders are going to fulfill a couple of requirements as far as I'm concerned. They're either going to illustrate some real changes or some major ways that they make their living. In other words, their lifestyles and the way that they do things. Probably more importantly, I'm going to emphasize the orders that do have an impact on you. These are ones that you will experience. They're the ones that eat our crops. They're the ones that infest our homes and our buildings. They're the ones that infest you. I didn't used to talk very much about bed bugs. We will talk a lot about bed bugs in this course because they've again risen back to being very important. I almost thought about dropping fleas, but fleas are fighting back. We're finding out that all these people that have been using the topical flea spots on their fleas and so forth, guess what? The fleas are becoming resistant to those insecticides. So you really do need to know a little bit about flea life cycles and their biology and why you need a multi-prong approach to manage fleas other than just dosing Fido or Fifi with a flea spot once every month. Okay, again, I don't expect you to memorize these scientific names. Deal? I will use the common names with these. When I use a scientific name in a quiz or an exam, the common name will be there. The reason why I do that, most of you should know the common names of these. At least the dominant orders that we'll talk about. There'll be a couple of the orders where you may not know that. I'm not sure that every one of you knows what a mayfly is. You may have heard a mayfly, but you may not know exactly what a mayfly is. But we'll talk about that. Those are the Ephemeroptera. But again, I'll put those in there. One of the other things that I find is kind of interesting in this one is that some real interesting things have changed biologically that I want to point out to you. I don't see an order Isoptera in here. Notice that I've now put Isoptera into the cockroaches. What? Termites are cockroaches? Most entomologists almost fell out of our chairs when the molecular genetic people said, hey, I don't know why you've got these as two different orders, because genetically termites and cockroaches are really very similar to each other. And everybody started scrambling and looking at the biology of these, and it was kind of funny. There was a cockroach, a couple of world's cockroach specialists that said, we've known this for years, you just never listened to us. And we said, what do you mean? He says, you know, there are two social cockroaches. We go, what? There are these couple of little obscure species. Actually, we have one of them here in Ohio. I've seen it many times. I just didn't realize that it was a social species. So we think that was actually, and what's also amazing is this social species lives in dead, decaying wood, the same thing that termites eat. And so we've lost an order of insects in here. On the other hand, just about a decade ago, there were some people in South Africa that said, we keep finding these weird-looking insects that look sort of like a cross between a praying mantis and a walking stick. Which order should we put them into? Should we put them into the walking stick order, or should we put them in the praying mantis order? We looked at them molecularly and genetically and said, neither. They're their own order. And so that's where that mantis Phasmid is the walking stick. So they just said these are things that look like a praying mantis and a walking stick, but they're in their own order. Why am I mentioning to this? I want you to understand, everybody thinks that we know everything that needs to be known about biology and about taxonomy and so forth. No, we're still learning. We know a lot about these, but we're still learning. Science always takes little baby steps forward. Every year we learn more, and things may divide, things may combine. Now, I'm a neuropterist. That's my specialty, is the neuroptera, and it's always bothered me that there were 3 main suborders of the neuroptera. They don't look alike. They have very different biology. I've always wondered why this just doesn't make any sense to me. Guess what? 2 of the new textbooks that I've seen come out have now divided that neuroptera into 3 orders. They're finally recognizing that, yeah, these really, even though they're little small groups, they need to be at their own ordinal level. And so, again, things are changing. All we need is the scientific information, and when we get enough scientific information, we have to be willing to change our mind on this. And I know it gets a little bit disturbing for people who are not really into this. You know, why isn't it always this way? Well, we get new information, and we have to accept that new information and modify our thoughts about these. Briefly, what we're going to see here is that there's 2 primary groups of these hexapods. Now, when I say hexapod, that merely means that they have those 3 pairs of legs, or 6 legs in there. There are some what we consider to be, and you'll hear me often be very hesitant to say primitive, because primitive to an entomologist is not a word that we like to use, or most biologists don't like to use that. The word that we like to say is ancestral. And when we say ancestral, is what we mean is that we think in the early evolution or the early development, these are the characteristics or features that that organism had, and over time those features changed, modified, and so forth. And so when I say ancestral, to you, I'm really saying primitive. Got that? We think the ancestral hexapod, the thing that gave rise to the true hexapods that have wings, didn't have wings. And we actually have fossil records of that. There's this really one strange fossil that has what appears to be 3 pairs of wings. Wow. It's got a big flap on the pronotum, a big flap on the mesonotum, and a big flap on the metanotum. And go, wow. But can you imagine trying to flap 3 wings? It obviously didn't work very well, and so that one became extinct pretty quickly. Now, where it gets kind of interesting to me is that these hexapods, and these are the Entognathus and the Ectognathus apterygote. Ap means without, pteri means wing, so those are the without the wings. Those are the without the wing things. And what we find, what they say is Entognathus. Gnathus means jaw. So one of these has an Entognathus. They have an internal jaw inside of the head capsule. The Ectognathus means the jaw is on the outside or attached to the outside of the head capsule. You don't need to know that. That's beyond what we're going to have. I just kind of want you to get an idea of what's going on here. All of the insects that have true wings have an ectognathous mandible. The mandible is attached to the outside of the head capsule. So in the newer books, these ones that say they are the Entognathus hexapods, they're now being put into a separate class by themselves. It's a little tiny class by themselves, because they said these diverged off really early on. They're really not on the evolutionary line that gave rise to the insects as we know it today. On the other hand, these other ones, the Microcoryphera and the Thysanura, generally are being retained. because they were on the same evolutionary line that gave rise to all the rest of these. Also notice in here that I have divided out all these orders that have that simple or incomplete metamorphosis. That means they're going to have an egg stage, a nymph stage, and an adult stage, as opposed to those that have the complete metamorphosis. Now here's again where it gets really confusing to beginning students. This would kind of give you the idea that there are more insects that have an incomplete metamorphosis. No. Over 80% of the species of insects have a complete life cycle or a complete metamorphosis. Why? We, again, don't know. But the hypothesis here is that if you're an insect that has this simple life cycle, both the eggs, nymphs, and adults are eating the same food and living in the same habitat. Boy, that makes it really good for a predator or a parasite or a disease to take you out. On the other hand, if I'm a caterpillar feeding on a plant at one time of the year, yet I'm a butterfly flitting around feeding on nectar at another time of the year, that makes it a lot harder for predators and parasites and diseases to attack you and take out your entire population. And so we think having a complex life cycle also makes it more complicated for natural controls, things that can take you out of the ball game in there. But if you have a simple life cycle, it makes it easier for things to find you and take you out. All right, we're going to have a little bit of time here to discuss a couple of the apterygote orders of insects. Now, ap means, again, without. Oh, where does the name pterygote come from? What's a pterodactyl? It's a winged reptile. And so pterygote means wings. And so apterygote means without wings, and pterygote means with wings. Yes? Both of these are both apterygotes. Both of these do not have. And all I'm doing here is, remember in that first list, I had these separated out. But here, I'm only going to talk about these two orders in here, and so I've just put them in here. These are, again, insects. And notice here I've also said, well, I kind of lied to you that there were these two types of metamorphosis, that there was the incomplete and complete. There's a lot of books that say these are ametabolists. These don't even have a metamorphosis. No, that's not really correct. But when we say it's without a metamorphosis, it means there's virtually little change other than size. And here's the other deal. When these reach adulthood, most of these may continue to molt even as a sexually mature adult. So that's another kind of a reason why they say, well, they don't have a real metamorphosis because they just keep molting. They only become sexually mature, but even after they're sexually mature, they continue to shed their exoskeleton and molt. Again, I mentioned to you before, the Springtails are now actually considered to be in their own class of arthropods, but we're going to consider them here as being a hexapod and with the insects. The one that's under the true line of the hexapoda would be the Thysanura, the silverfish, and the firebrats. The Collembola, to me, are some really fascinating arthropods and insect-like critters. They're all extremely tiny. For those of you that might be in natural resources, this is a major group now that's being used as bioindicators of environmental quality. And there's two reasons for that. Within this group of the Collembola, there are species that are extremely sensitive to pollution. And then there are other species that are extremely tolerant of pollution. And so when you're doing sampling of the soil or leaf litter and things like that, and you see this one group present that's not tolerant of pollution, you say, that's got to be a pretty clean environment. But if you go out and do that sampling and all of a sudden you only find these ones that can tolerate pollution, then you say, whoa, there's probably some chemicals here that maybe we ought to analyze for and find out what's polluting this particular area. They're called springtails because they have these two other structures in there, the cauliform and the furcula. You don't need to remember those two names. But basically what it is that they've got a special organ that folds up underneath the abdomen. That's this furcula. And the furcula, when they're disturbed, they've got muscles in it and they can spring it down and it flips them into the air. That's why they have this springy tail that they can jump with. Now, I think springtails are, like I said, they're fascinating. It's too bad they're just so little itty-bitty tiny. They've got some fascinating behavior. I'll show you some great videos of their behavior for this. But in essence, they can also cause problem. People buy potted flower plants and bring them in, and they set a potted flower plant on the dining room table, and they didn't realize that there might be springtails feeding in the molds and mildews of the growing media. So they sit there, and all of a sudden something goes pink, and jumps out of the flower pot, and it lands on the table and goes pink, pink. And they go, oh my God, our plant's got fleas in it. No, they're springtails, and don't worry about them. Not going to be a problem. Now, this cauliform is a special organ, and as you can see, none of this stuff is really insect-like. Yeah, they have 6 legs, but boy, the rest of this stuff is like, they have this water regulatory structure. They basically have this reversible drum-like thing sticking in the middle of their thorax, and apparently they can extend this out and absorb water. They can actually secrete water through it and use it as a cleaning sponge. They'll clean their bodies off with this thing. Really weird. Again, features. They are primarily wingless. They never had wings. They do have chewing mouth parts, but the chewing mouth parts are inside of the head capsule. They do have that gradual metamorphosis, and what we're meaning is that the adults can continue to molt. Even though they become sexually mature adults, they can continue to molt. Most of these are detritivores, feeding on decaying plant material and things like that. But there are some that are bacteriophores. They specifically eat bacteria. Some are fungivores that feed specifically on fungi. There are some blue-green algae feeders. And there's one that's really hit the press recently. They've discovered a couple of species of these that feed on plant parasitic nematodes. And so they're trying to figure out, can we encourage these to eat some of the nematodes that attack our plants and so forth. As I indicated to you before, they're really now considered to be very important bioindicator species. And more people are studying these as an indicator of environmental quality and health. Here's what they look like. As I indicated to you before, a really big springtail is maybe 4 millimeters in length. Most of them are only 1 millimeter or 2 in length, quite small. It's also a fairly small group. There's only 6,000 species. That's worldwide. Okay, that's all that's found worldwide. Most of them are sort of elongate in shape, and here you can see one with that jumping tail that has been sprung out, and you can see it's a little spring-like. Normally that would be folded up underneath. You can see on this globular springtail right here, here's the furcula folded up underneath the abdomen and the thorax, and it's ready whenever it's disturbed. It's going to spring that out, and it's going to propel it in the air. And again, originally we thought that these things were pretty good gliders, that they probably landed on their feet and so forth. We'll show you in a video. No, they just flip themselves in the air, and they may land on their head, they might land on the side, they might land on their butt, whatever, but they'll quickly upright themselves and get on their way. I especially like the little globular springtails. They look like little trolls to me. And you've got to be a little bit careful. What looks like eyes in here are really pigment spots. I keep wondering, why do they have pigment spots that look like eyes. They do have eyes, but they have what we consider to be very simple eyes that are located on the side of the head, not where those quote eye spots are. There are some of these that are quite colorful, but unfortunately, again, they're fairly small. This is an Entomology springtail that's got all this multicolored hairs and patches and things on it, but that's all of 2 millimeters in length. It's really tiny. There's some others that have some really interesting behavior. We have a group of springtails that are called the aquatic springtails. These feed on blue-green algae that grow along the edge of shores and on the surface of water. That's what they're feeding on. And there's also a group of these aquatic springtails that during the winter time convert a lot of their sugars into an antifreeze-like material, and they can remain active even when the temperatures are down around, usually above 20 degrees, but at least below freezing. And they're really bizarre. I don't know if any of you like to go hiking or walking during the wintertime or snow skiing, but sometimes you'll be traveling and you'll see what looks like a pink patch or a purple patch on the surface of the snow. And if you go over and look at it, what you'll find is that it's thousands of these little springtails, and we call those snow fleas. So a snow flea is nothing more than a winter active springtail. Our next group, this will be the last one, are the Thysanura. Thyson means bristle, so these are the bristletails. These are the silverfish and firebrats. Again, these are ones that never had wings. They were originally wingless. They are often covered with scales. In the case of a silverfish, they're silvery scales. In the case of a firebrat, they're sort of multicolored grays and white scales that are in there. They have no metamorphosis, and the adults can continue to molt. That was real shocking to me. I'd caught a silverfish that I wanted to get a picture of, and by the time I got it back, all the scales had gotten rubbed off of it. Oh man, that's a horrible looking thing. And I put it in a little box with some dog food kibbles and so forth. Came back a couple of days later, and it was a beautiful silver color again. And I go, oh, I fed you enough that you were able to molt again, and when you molted again, you got the scale covering back on your exoskeleton. The name bristletail refers to that they typically have these 3 long tails at the tip of the abdomen. Most of these feed on plant material and starches. Here's what they look like. The silverfish, now this poor little silverfish here, you can see it's got 2 these are called Circe tails, and 1 median tail. Now this median tail, part of that's been broken off. Here's a 4-line silverfish. It would be similar to the firebrat, has this modeling, but again you can see that center median tail and 2 side tails. So those are the 3 tails in there. Now, silverfish used to be really common in almost every one of our homes. We don't see them very much anymore. How did we decorate our rooms? We put wallpaper up. And how did we put that wallpaper up? We use starch glue. So if you think about it, we built our homes, we put starch glue under the wallpaper, and every time the wallpaper kind of got loose there, perfect food for silverfish in there. A few years ago, and again, I don't mean to annoy anybody here, but it was kind of interesting. Silverfish, again, were very uncommon in the student dorms. In the late 80s and early 90s, and late in the 90s, all of a sudden I started getting reports of silverfish in the women's bathrooms in some of our dorms. What did you girls do? Well, if you've ever watched cosmetics, now some of you're not old enough to know this, but back in the 70s and 80s, we used cornstarch-based makeup. Then they went to elemental makeup. And you can even still today see, there's earth element makeup out there. And what is that? Talcum powder. And so talcum powder, silverfish can't eat. but it can eat starch-based, cornstarch-based makeups. And so as society, we switched from one to the other. And what was happening is people were saying we need to stop using some of the talcum powder. And so the obvious conclusion was to switch back over to the cornstarch-based makeups. You were providing food for the silverfish.